What's the most messed up thing you ever heard? Story 1. My cousin went on a work trip, and when she came home, she found her boyfriend dead in the living room. Their dogs had chewed off most of his face. I have no idea how she was able to cope with that kind of trauma. I feel sick just thinking about it. Story 2. Earlier today, watched an interrogation on YouTube of a woman who starved her baby to death because instead of feeding him, she was doing lactation cam shows and selling the milk to strangers. She had no remorse at all. Story 3. My aunt was prison roomies with a meth head who was in a psychotic episode cut her newborn's lips off with nail clippers. Baby died from blood loss, and the mother ripped out her eyes in front of a church after realizing what she did. She pled guilty and last I heard was paroled a few years ago after serving like 10 years. Edit, her own eyes. Wasn't totally blind because she didn't sever the nerves, so they were put back into the sockets, but was still visually impaired because of the damage. Story 4. I'm taking this as the most fucked up thing I've heard in person. Used to work at the meat department of a grocery store, and as you can imagine, it's very male heavy. Not a single chick worked in about any food department except baking. Guy from deli comes around to chat at one point, and I'm overhearing because we're in the middle of a busy store. Out loud talks about a situation where a young girl who was a courtesy clerk got accidentally shocked by a trash compactor in front of him, to which he adds that she should have been glad they hadn't been alone, and that if they had been, he would have had his way with her unconscious. Mouth dropped hearing a dude just say this so nonchalantly out loud at work. No shame. Story 5. Read about a story where this lady was in her apartment and passed out and died shortly after a heat stroke. Her 2-year-old died a few days later from dehydration. A welfare check was made by her family and they found all cupboards and cabinets near the sink open, and they figured it was the toddler opening everything looking for food or something to drink. Neighbors did hear the kid crying but didn't think much of it. Story 6. When I was in high school, we were riding the bus to school and the bus driver had the radio playing. The station was reporting a story about some guy who got arrested while in the act of fucking a dead deer on the side of the road. The whole bus bursted into laughter. Story 7. In the 80s, my grandma went to visit her 6-month-old step-grandson who had Down syndrome and found him severely emaciated with wounds on his body. His mother had been starving him, hurting him, and dropping him on purpose. He was almost dead when my grandma found him. My grandma got custody of him and raised him as her own. She had since died, and now all of her kids have helped to take care of him. He's not blood related to any of us, but it doesn't matter. He's ours. Screw his bio mom. Story 8. I worked in fast food for far too long. Didn't directly witness it, but an irate coworker told me about it a few days later. I had a coworker who was prone to seizures. One morning while the owner is there, she goes into a seizure and it is severe. Ends up biting through her tongue so hard that after the EMTs got her, she spends an entire week into the hospital. The owner, instead of calling for help, steps over her still seizing body and demands a double cheeseburger because we still need to keep these lines moving. Needless to say, I kept my distance after that. I know higher-ups can be soulless, but God almighty. Story 9. My sister was getting divorced from a psychopath who said in court he only wanted to split custody with one of his 2 children. He didn't care about the other. The child was 9 at the time. She will never find out about this. Story 10. I met this female trumpet player. She came home late from a gig. She stayed real quiet, kept the lights off, and got into bed next to her husband gently as so not to wake him up. The next morning, she woke up to find that he had blown his brains out with a pistol before she ever got home. She slept next to his corpse all night and then woke up to find him like that. Story 11. During a group discussion in speech class, we were talking about violence in our area when my classmate began to tell us a story about her family's experience with the Mexican cartel. She said her brother had gotten into some trouble in Mexico and had alerted the family that he was in a bad spot, and after that they didn't hear from him for a while until they got a message with an address. The parents went on a flight to Mexico that night only to be met with his body parts stuffed into trash bags with his head sitting right on top. Story 12. I have 2. Some guy who hangs out near a notorious homeless house spot in my city will apparently let you, pleasure yourself using his stoma hole for the cheap price of $20. Second one is less funny. I knew a guy who was affiliated with a street gang. He got beef with another crew. 2 of the rival group broke into his house, beat him up, held him down, and gouged out his eyes with their thumbs. Tortured the guy. His eyes are permanently damaged beyond repair, and he relies on his family to get around and do day-to-day tasks. Always feel bad for him when I think about it. Story 13. I highly recommend the podcast Well There's Your Problem, a podcast about engineering disasters with slides. They cover many engineering and societal disasters, one of which is their recording equipment. It's not a podcast format for everyone. They meander a bit and talk over each other, but usually it's so funny and I cannot recommend enough. Anyway, at the end of the show, they have a listener write-in bit called Safety Third, Shake Hands with Danger, where listeners send in their OSHA violation stories, and one guy wrote in about the time he worked at a wire factory. One of the things you have to do to process metal into wire is bathe it in acid apparently, and so there was big vats of acid that workers sometimes had to walk around or over on walkways. One guy had the walkway collapse under him, and the sentence from the report that I could not get out of my head is, if he would have screamed, he would have died because the acid would have filled his throat and his skin has already been exposed to the maximum amount of acid a human could survive. Story 14. A guy I used to be friends with got pissed at a kid in his old school. Rather than do what any normal person would do and ignore him, he decided to befriend him, became his best friend, the person he shared everything with, and then proceeded to isolate him from everyone in his life, convince him meth would help, got him addicted, and then laughed when he heard the guy OD'd and died. Story 15. I had a friend who came from a very religious family. His brother wanted to commit suicide but did not want the family to know, so to make it look like an accident, he got really drunk and then went into the woods wearing just a t-shirt and shorts, and he buried himself in the snow. He was found frozen, and I'm pretty sure he died of hypothermia. Story 16. So my dad used to be a paramedic, and he told me that one time he went to a case where this man was screaming down the phone, but they couldn't understand what he was saying. They get to the scene, and there's a 40-year-old man on all fours naked in pain. They ask him what's wrong, but he's too in pain to reply. Him and his team sit down on this chair and hear a loud pop. Turns out that guy shoved 32 big pins up his ass and couldn't get them out. When they sat him down, all 32 pierced his bowel. He did live though. Story 17. I was taking a pee in a rest stop in a rural part of Ohio, and I overheard two men who worked there through event discussing which bank they were going to rob next and how they were going to do it. I got the duck out. Story 18. I heard a mom walk into a bar and actively say her husband was a pussy and that she willingly cheats on him so he can divorce and take all his money. Like fake everything kind of woman. Slept with the guys who did coke in the bathroom, always a handful to deal with. Eventually, her husband found out, but recorded enough evidence to do a no-contest divorce where she was unfit to raise her kids, do her job, and other things. Got to keep everything and had to pay, I think, only $500 in spousal support if she went to rehab. Story 19. This coming from my own mother when I was about 10 or so. For context, I asked her if she loved her kids more than our new stepdad. She proceeded to tell me, well, the Bible says that I should love God first, then my husband, then my children. It may seem like an inconsequential thing to say, but that shit fucked with my head for so long. That and other things that happened, but this memory is fucking carved into my skull. Story 20. I read in my local paper about a couple who were making meth. They used something like battery acid and it was in a cup. Their kid drank it. The kid screamed for a long time before the neighbor came to check it out. The neighbor had to force the parents to drive the kid to the hospital. He followed them the entire way to make sure and called ahead. The neighbor ended up being my stepmom's nephew. He's a big scary dude, but he wasn't about to let that little girl suffer further. It was sad to hear about. Story 21. As a child, my dad worked in a non-profit. We went abroad to an orphanage where moms would drop off special needs kids or kids so severely abused that they couldn't really function. Watching my own mom love these kids and hold them is something I will never ever forget. I held some of the babies, the ones that were a bit smaller and that I could manage to hold. I didn't want us to leave them. It made me so sad because there's no love quite like a mother's love, and these kids needed it most and had been abandoned. They didn't have enough workers to fully attend to everyone. I can still see all their sweet innocent faces and joyful smiles when we held them, fed them, spent time. Just haunts me to no end, even years and years later. Story 22. When I was about 9, my friend Jason called to say he was coming over. This was the 80s, so no cell phones. So after he was taking way too long to get there, I called. His grandma said he just left a little bit ago, so I waited. He still didn't show. We lived in a dangerous part of town in Section 8, and so I started to get nervous again. He was only a block away. Why would it take so long? I called Graham again, and she was like, well, maybe he saw a friend on the way. Check outside. So I did. I went outside, and his dead body was by the entrance to my building. His coat and shoes were gone. It seemed someone murdered a little boy for his fucking stuff. I had the pleasure of discovering him and testifying at the guy's grand jury later. Story 23. Heard plenty of the tragedies of the people around me. Sweet old lady that had 3 sons, all dead. 1 motorcycle accident, 2 cancer. All pursuing kids, but not having succeeded yet. She is not okay, but very much coping by putting all of her time into her hobby. The hospital kicking out my elderly neighbor after extracting all of his remaining teeth. They had started to fall out. They deemed him too fragile for the appropriate painkillers, and they couldn't spare a bed. We got a cryptic text from him, so we went by to find him sitting next to the entrance, looking like he had seen a monster. Almost that look you see in the demented people's eyes. Both the process and the recovery traumatized him badly. I have a long list. The elderly here have usually seen some shit and experienced some shit. Story 24. A joke about the recent house fire in Arizona that saw a man's 5 young children lose their lives while he was Christmas shopping. Someone said I hoped he kept the receipts, usually into a bit of shock humor, but didn't land with me, I'm afraid. Story 25. We had our neighbor barricade himself in his house with a gun to his head. He was on a ton of pills and SSRIs, and they finally got the best of him. Anyway, I was over at my other neighbor's watching it all unfold, and he would randomly shoot the gun inside the house. His family was there, and every time he shot, they would scream in fear of him taking his own life, which was gut-wrenching enough. But after a 4-hour standoff, the police finally decided to use a battering ram on the front of a SWAT truck to push the door in. When the truck finally pushed the door in, we all heard the final gunshot he fired, which took his own life. It came over the radio and the police cruisers in front of the house, which is how his family found out he had passed. The screams they let out trying to get to his body are ones that I can still vividly hear, even though this happened more than a month ago. Story 26. I remember when my friend said that she would marry a really hot guy and have his babies. I thought this would just be a normal conversation, but then she continued and said, but when the kids turn 18, I would fuck them if they looked like my husband. So basically would have a hot young husband forever. I was shocked nonetheless, like, hello? But scrolling through this thread, this doesn't even seem that bad. Story 27. Guy in a town somewhat near me had his 2 kids riding with him on a tractor with a combine on the back of it. One of the kids needed to move for some reason, and the other opened the door and fell out when the dad leaned to help the first kid. He stopped it and got out, but it was too late. The kid was in literally hundreds of pieces, and the dad wordlessly left his other son in the middle of the field, gathered the pieces in his hands, and walked to the hospital, and I think passed out. They had to put him on an insane drug cocktail and under constant surveillance because of the experience. I haven't heard anything recently, but last I heard he had just gone home. Story 27. A girl I met in an NA meeting told me she OD'd on heroin once and that the people who were with her were saying they should chop her up and leave her body in a ditch. I don't know how, even though she couldn't move or speak, she still heard the whole thing, unable to do anything. She eventually reacted, so nothing happened, but that story definitely gave me the chills. Story 28. My grandmother killed my dad's dog when he was 12. His father, her husband, had just died from cancer. My dad had a dog that suddenly got sick. He put all of his effort into nursing the dog back to health. One day, he came home from school and found it dead on the basement stairs. It wasn't until my dad was married that he found out the truth. She told my mom that she gassed it in the garage because she didn't want to deal with the dog anymore. My poor father beat himself up for years that he couldn't save the dog. Evil woman. Story 29. Jeanette McCurdy lived a fucked up life. Her cancer survivor mother forced her into the Mormon religion and made her audition for child acting roles because it was a childhood dream of Jeanette's mom to be one. Jeanette had bulimia and anorexia because her mother imprinted an image on her to be a child forever. Deborah McCurdy would wash Jeanette in the shower, telling her how to be anorexic and stay skinny forever. The character she played on Nickelodeon seemed to mock her lifestyle directly because she would be obsessed with food and eat copious amounts of it. This led to her binging and purging in real life. She resented Nickelodeon for treating her terribly, even going as far as sexually harassing her. Deborah's cancer eventually came back. When she died from it, she blamed it on Jeanette. Even though Jeanette had seen her die before her eyes near her hoarded piles of stuff, she didn't cry. Even though she'd known how to cry on command since she was a child actress. Her dad later told her that he wasn't her biological father. This is all written out in her autobiography. Story 30. There was a dashcam video where a woman dies from an incoming brick fallen from the vehicle in front that breaks through the car windshield. She was sitting in the passenger seat and her husband was driving. You can't see her face, but the blood-curdling scream the husband made when he saw what just happened would forever be in my mind.